Thank you for downloading the Hong Kong Writers Circle podcast. For more information, please visit our website hkwriterscircle.com. Harshni Chauhan is from the Himalayan town of Shimla. She has been living in China since 2002 and has worked in both India and China in higher education and corporate learning and development. She has also run an NGO in southwest China. Her parenting memoir, Visa, Stickers and Other Matters of the Soul, has just been published by Macmillan, India. Welcome, Law.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me here.
So, your book is a parenting memoir. It is also kind of a brief history of your time in a couple of places in China, and also some reflections on your and your daughter's spiritual journey when she was a bit younger than she is now. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that synopsis?
Yes. So the book is about how I was trying to give her some of the best practices of my culture, especially since she wasn't growing up in India. Most of this learning happened through conversations between us, and I found that as we progressed in that journey, it ended up a lot about being about identity, both mine and hers.
Yeah, I found that. I think that you mentioned at one point that it was you found that you discovered as much about yourself as you maybe passed on to your daughter.
Yes, because as a parent, there's a totally different side of yourself that you get to see, and the challenges are totally different from what you face in your normal days. So children who reflect everything that you do, they put a mirror up to you, and you find, from a spiritual perspective, you find there is just so much there is to reflect on. And of course, beyond all this, it's a book which is very relevant to not just parents, but I said because of identity, to anyone who is looking inwards. And of course for parents, whoever is raising a third culture child, because I think they face very similar challenges.
Right. Yeah. I want to read a little quotation from your very recent review in the Huffington Post. And this is what they said about you. It said, "Following no particular narrative arc other than conversations between the author and her smart little daughter about things like souls, supreme souls, ethics and courage, Chauhan's writing takes us into a world many women and men of a particular generation are living through right now, but have somehow lacked an adequate literary or cinematic reflection for, at least one so rich and compelling. It's the story of my generation," this is the critic's generation, "as it enters middle age and parenthood and realises suddenly that the world in which we have to bring up our children is incredibly different from the world our parents seemingly took for granted when we were children. Though Chauhan doesn't theorise it in that way, students of culture and religion will see an incredible, humbling, worrisome and still hopeful phenomenon in her work, the emergence of a careful, critical self-consciousness in matters of religiosity as well as parenting." And I wonder if it's maybe not a contrast, but the cover maybe doesn't suggest that. On the cover there is a mother and daughter holding hands and walking along on the beach. So my question to you is, which one would you say describes the book better?
I think both do, because in the journey that my daughter and I embarked on, that journey is very reflective of what every parent goes through. It's the same concerns. We all want to give the best start to our child. We all want to leave an enduring legacy with them. And beyond that, I think how it is, what you mentioned in the Huffington Post, is that my parents' generation didn't have the luxury, whether by time or by financial resources. They didn't have that time to devote individual attention to each child. I think even in some cases, even the concept wasn't there. Children weren't really raised as much as they just grew. There were lots of relatives around. It was a very different culture then. But now their challenges are so much. People are scattered all around the world. There are no families. Many cases, like my daughter, there are no siblings. So the parents, and especially the mother or the father, whoever's taking care, is the only source of security that the child has. And so it becomes a very, very intimate journey between the parent and the child, which perhaps wasn't there before. So I think both are very true.
Did you intend to write something like almost like a philosophy or sort of a commentary on the modern world, or is that something that just emerged?
Now, I didn't set out to write a commentary, but I think I did want to bring to the world something which had been a very important and valuable part of my growing up years, which was the spiritual parenting I had received, partly from my parents, but mainly from my spiritual guru, who I refer to as Master. I think that was even more than what I call in the book my biological parents. So even in many ways, as I've grown older, I've realized that part is more what I relate to now than even my own parents, and what I've got from them. So I did want to share that aspect of parenting, because that is something I think many of us don't concentrate on enough. Many of us do try to give religion to our child, but not necessarily what beyond religion. We end where religion is.
I think that's especially true in Hong Kong. I wonder though, you talk about your parents' generation and how you were raised, and compare it to how your daughter is being raised. Do you think that maybe how it was is better? Are you trying to sort of emulate that, or do you think that that it's your duty to do something completely different, maybe to achieve the same ends or to achieve different ends?
I think every time period has some things which are good. So yes, some things you do carry forward, but our challenges are so different from our parents' generation. I don't think everything can be brought forward, which is true of traditions, which is true of norms, whether they're spiritual or religious or social. It's true of, and I think it's true everywhere all around the world. So nothing can be emulated as it is, but some things, yes, need to, and that's what I try to do, and that's what this book is about, picking the best practices and giving that to her.
What caused you to write this memoir?
There were a couple of reasons. I think the first was that my daughter was 5 when I started this, and it was her questions. She discovered death, and she discovered that my mother might die, and I'll be, who look after me? And those. I think it's around 5 is when they start worrying about these things. So we started having conversations on death and rebirth, and then the Hindu concepts around that, reincarnation, rebirth. And some of these conversations were really funny and amusing, and they were also very, they opened my eyes to a very different world that the child has. And I had never thought a small child can actually process all those things. So partly it was that. I started sharing that, writing short blog posts and sharing with my friends. And that's how it evolved from there. And the second part was what I mentioned a little earlier about the parenting I had received from our master, and I wanted to share that goodness, because in modern society I think it is so easy, even in a place like India where these kind of people are quite naturally revered and easily revered, but even there is this tendency, I think, to dismiss people of a certain level of spiritual attainment, and we don't realize often how few of these are there at any given time in the world. And I'm talking about really very, very, very evolved souls. At any given time, there are very few of these around the world. But because we are so busy in our tangible, lives, our work and children and marriage and illness, and the gifts that these people give are often intangible. So it becomes very easy to dismiss their contribution to society. So it was both these things. I think I wanted to bring out that aspect, because these kind of forces, whichever religion they may belong to, whichever society they are in, they are very anchoring as a society. They anchor society in some very good values. And I think it's important as parents to disseminate those core values further into our, to our children, so that it builds up society. So there was an element of doing my bit towards the world. Like I write in the book that I was a young girl, I wanted to change the world. So I think when I was writing this book, I had that feeling that this is my little bit in trying to send out a good thought. And what I actually, if I may add something, what I learned while growing up in India, and I think that has been the best thing about India through centuries, is the inclusiveness. And India has traditionally been a very inclusive society, and these kind of people, wherever they are, like I said, in any society, they don't limit themselves to, pray at this time or wear this. They might set these things, rules, because of course everything needs a structure, but they don't. What they really talk about are very core values, like love or peace, and those are really very similar, whether they are from Christianity or from Hinduism or any other religion. So I feel that if as parents we paid more attention to those core values, we really can build a better society.
I mean, generally I find it quite amazing. I've sort of thought about maybe writing down some things about being a parent, but I don't think I would ever be able to find the time, and I don't think I'd ever be able to gather my thoughts to be able to do it, although I would quite like to. I can see how it sort of emerged from a blog. That makes a lot of sense, because
Yes.
you're not quite so committed with a blog, and then you've sort of got everything there. You can go back to it,
Right.
sort of an aid to your memory. I think it must have been a very difficult undertaking, and especially to have certain themes and arguments that run through the whole of the book. Is that true for you?
No, actually, it was strange. I thought it was strange. When I started writing, I actually didn't think that I would write a book, because I'm not a writer. So the whole idea of being able to write a book seemed very audacious. It's just not something you do if you're not a writer. So when I started writing, I thought, let me see if I can make it into something longer. And that's how I thought of it, something longer. I didn't want to say the word book, even to myself. And it was only later, once I had maybe 1/3 of it, that I thought, oh, maybe this can be a book. But for me, actually, it went very smooth. And things just, because it was happening in real time and things were happening, I felt I just had to just write it down. So it happened very easily, but again, I don't know if I ever had to do it again, if I could do it, but at that point it really happened very naturally. It was very organic.
Well, my question then is, do you consider yourself to be a writer now?
Not yet. I still don't identify myself as a writer. I feel I'm someone who happened to write a book. Maybe if I'm able to write something else, I might. But that's not my self-identity yet.
Are you writing anything at the moment? Do you continue with your blog, for example?
I started a new blog. That was a new blog which I had stopped when I was writing the book. I want to write. I'm just finding myself not in that frame of mind. I think because I'm more involved in the promotion aspect of it, which is so different. So I'm not finding that state of mind. And I'm not disciplined enough or trained enough to do it despite all that. I want to write a children's story, perhaps. Or sometimes I think maybe if I could convert this book into more child-friendly and, written from a child's perspective, or maybe something more appropriate to, say 15 years old or 12 years old, something like that. But they're just thoughts. I haven't actually got down to do anything yet.
Okay, well, something for us to look forward to. I don't know if my next question is still terribly relevant, but I'll ask it anyway. Is your book about parenting, actually, or is it more about spirituality?
Okay. See, in Hinduism, spirituality is not something which is divorced from real life. It's something which happens in each and every aspect of your life. So whether it's music or anything, whether it's working on an assembly line, everything has potential to lead you to the highest level of spiritual attainment. And parenting, by virtue of it's the nature, and it's like we said, the qualities and the challenges that it throws up to develop certain qualities, it's actually very, very suited to spiritual growth. So I won't say it is this or that, because they're so interlinked. It's for those who are looking at a parenting thing, it's a parenting book. For those who are looking at a spiritual journey, it's a spiritual
Right. Yeah.
journey.
I mean, and clearly what I took from it was the parenting aspect, because that's something
Right.
that's still relatively new to me. And
Right.
something that I think about a lot. I wanted to ask, I'm guessing you're going to say that you didn't have a target audience in mind as you were writing, but who do you think that your book would appeal to most, and do you feel that it's aimed at the Indian market, or how do you feel about that?
No, actually, this is one of the 2 or 3 things that I was sure of. That I thought I'm going to write for an Indian audience, especially Indians who are outside India. That's how I started. But I have realized, especially after the book has been printed and people are reading it, that it is actually being received very well, irrespective of races, irrespective of geographies, and irrespective of ideology. So I have atheist friends who've read it, and they have actually liked it. They've enjoyed it, and which was a huge surprise, because I wouldn't have expected them to, I would have thought, oh, hogwash, but they enjoyed it. And I've had Muslim readers, I've had Christian readers, and of course Hindu readers. So I've had Westerners, I've had Asians. I haven't had a Chinese yet, so we'll know what they think about it.
I'll get my wife to read it.
Yes. So I started with a very Indian, which is why actually there are not, some concepts are not explained much, because to write for a non-Indian audience would have a lot more descriptions about certain terms. But to an Indian audience, it doesn't make sense to explain what an ashram is or guru is.
But then, I mean, what you said to me when we first started emailing about this was pretty much like, anything you don't understand, send me an email or just look it up on Google.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I didn't really feel that I needed to. Some of the things I may not have really especially understood them, but I knew enough to keep reading, and it didn't really interfere with my understanding of the book overall. So
yes, that's what my worry was. But that's what I found, that people, or like one French friend of mine, he said, no, it just makes it more exotic. I said, okay. So it's become a feature. It's no longer a bug.
Right. So how about in terms of it being published by Pan Macmillan India? I mean, are they sort of aiming at just at India, or does it have sort of an international release?
The ebook is available globally. The print book is right now just in India. But let's see how it goes. I think Asian writers always have this difficulty of, I think, going beyond the shores. So let's see how that goes. But the ebook is available, and so let's see.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned in your introduction about third culture children. I wonder if you could explain that a little bit and talk about how you covered it in your book.
Third culture children, as you know, are children who are growing away from their home cultures. So my book is about my daughter, of course, who is in China, and my husband and I are both Indian. So Chinese is not her home country, of course, but because she's born here, she was raised here, there's a part of her which will always be Chinese, culturally, perhaps. When we go home to India for a couple of months, she misses Chinese food, and I have to buy some green vegetables and stir fry them because and all her cousins are like, she's eating, because Indian vegetables are really cooked and overcooked and cut small, and so they find that very strange to have these really long, almost uncooked vegetables. So it's I think always challenging for them, because they feel neither here nor there. they're not exposed enough. They don't have enough anchors in their own home country to be fully there. But they can never, unless you're immigrating, perhaps it's different. But like most of us who are here temporarily, our children will never be of this place, totally. And I find that very worrisome because, from a psychological perspective, I'm not a psychologist, but as a mother, I just worry: what does it mean for her sense of belongingness? What does she think of as home? Or in future? And I really sometimes I tell my husband I wouldn't be surprised if when she grows up, because she hates moving around. This is a third city in 9 years, and if she grows up, gets married, has 4 children, 3 dogs, and stays in one place for the next 30 years, because she has a strong sense of need to belong. And I think that is a challenge that my book also tries to explore. That what can we do? What could I do to somehow fill that gap? So in my book, it's more about the spiritual identity, by not limiting herself to the body or race. If she can go beyond that. And it's easier said than done because it's a lifelong process. But I just hope if I have started that process where she can look inwards and try to find that inner spiritual entity or whatever, I don't know what's the right term, but that identity within her, maybe that will transcend space and time and geography and give her peace wherever she is.
And when I was preparing for this podcast, I was thinking a little bit about parenting books, of which obviously, as I think many people do, I bought a lot of these books just before becoming a parent. And they have this special section in the bookshop, and I found that I keep my parenting books separate from all my other books, and I hadn't really thought about why that might be. And I just wondered what your perspective was on this.
Well, if it's a how-to-do manual, that tends to happen, right? How to grow a company, how to grow crops, how to grow children. So, but jokes aside, I think the dullness arises partly because we don't go beyond the obvious, right? We're worried about school and sports and getting them into best colleges and jobs. But whenever, the real excitement always begins when we go beyond our boundaries, in whichever direction it might be, in anything, whether it's career or whether it's parenting. I think the same principle applies, going beyond the obvious. Yeah, that's where excitement happens. So maybe if more books about parenting were less how-to-do manuals, how to be this great parent, but more just experiments, I think that niche thing might break a bit. That said, of course, organizing never hurt, right?
Sure. Describe the writing and publication process.
For me, the whole process actually went very smoothly. I didn't have any writer's block, luckily. I didn't have to think too much. Even many of the chapters that made it to the book, many of them were just the first drafts, just proofreading done, and but no rewrites. So I think I was extremely lucky in that.
How much of it came straight from the blog?
Oh, the blog was just 3 or 4 short posts.
Right.
So just the initial few chapters have some conversations, just that. And the rest was all later on. But I think it all went very, it was a very instinctive process for me. And I feel partly it might be because it was a subject which was really, really dear to me. And this really was a concept I really believed in. It was a concept, a book that I really thought needed to be written. And maybe because of that, that what I said about wanting to share the goodness that I had received, and maybe it was so much a part of my being that it's easy because it just flowed over from my life to paper. So luckily I didn't have, even the publishers it went very smoothly. I wrote to 6 or 7, 4 replied, 2 of them accepted. So I was really lucky, but I really don't think this would happen if I wrote again. So it's a little scary because this really went very well.
I don't know. You got one under your belt already. I would have thought it might. That would.
No, actually, now it's scary. Because the first time, I think there was no expectations. I didn't have any expectations from myself. I didn't think I was a writer. I didn't think I could write a book. So I thought, okay, worst case, whatever I write, if I can't find a publisher, I print it and I bind it and I leave it as a gift to my daughter. That was my plan. So there was absolutely no expectations. But now that I have a book, I think I have more expectations from myself, and that's scary.
Right. How about the editing process? I mean, did you go through many drafts? I mean, well, you said that some of it was first draft material, but how much involvement did the publishers have in that aspect?
Well, they did suggest a couple of things, but there weren't so many rewrites. I think 2 chapters we had to cut down on the material, but nothing major. I did have to go through it. I think after everything had been done, the final editing, I proofread it, I think, 5 times, because every time I kept coming up with some mistakes, some spelling mistakes, typos, just a lot of those things. No, it actually went off very smoothly.
Right.
I think I was in this strange spiritual bubble at that point of time in my life, and I think if you read the book, I hope it's come through. And in that state, I think it just flowed so naturally, and it made me actually understand and appreciate artists who do a lot more work, because it gave me a sense of what it means to be someone who can through whom an idea flows, and that's what it felt like to me. That I'm a medium through which an instrument through which an idea is flowing, which was the book, and that's how I saw myself in that role. So not as a writer, but more as an instrument for that idea, which is the book embodies.
Right. Well, related to that, I mean, we've covered this, and I did ask you before if you felt that whether you started off with a sort of a central philosophy or a central argument, but I'm just sort of wondering how you developed your overall sort of theme and arguments for the book in the writing. How did that develop?
Well, I had a main idea at the start. I wanted to write about how spirituality-based parenting can build a very strong inner core, which would be something that any child as he grows can always go back to and dip into whenever needed. And I think I had this, perhaps not at the beginning so much, because I just wrote little blog posts maybe, or just short paras. But after the initial work, I did have this small mind map kind of thing where I identified, okay, what are the factors which feed into that main idea, and what are the factors which lead from that main idea. And but it was very rough. And like I said, the book, I'm not a very good planner, so the whole, I didn't have any big, what's that thing called, like the book plan. So it happened very organically. Things were happening, and I started writing them down. And after I'd write a bit, and I would find, oh, there's a thread here. This thing actually ties in with this. And I just kept adding that, and that's how it built up. And then chapters got built up, and slowly the whole book came.
Right. And I mean, although perhaps you say that you're not much of a planner, I think it's clearly worked, especially for the HuffPost critic. That clearly has come through very well for him.
It did, yes.
And yeah, good for you.
Thank you.
I also, just going back to that article, I wanted to quote another little bit. The writer there, the journalist, describes you as funny, honest, and somehow self-deprecating and confident at the same time. And also, he later mentions that your fast-talking and funny, profound voice made him think this is how it might have been if Eat, Pray, Love had graduated into something called Love, Question, Parent, cross-culturally at that, end quote. And I think that the voice that you chose was very much a part of that. It clearly is for for that journalist, and it was for me, and it's something that I felt was very much forefronted in the writing. I just wondered how you chose to write with that particular voice, and how you felt that it manifests.
Well, it's my natural voice. I'm a chatty person, so it was the most natural thing for me to do. Second, this is one of those 2 or 3 things I said I was very clear on, that a topic such as this, which is essentially very serious, had to be written in a very light-hearted voice. It had to have humor, because otherwise it would be too boring even for me to read. And plus, I always felt that I don't know enough about parenting or life to tell anyone else what to do. So there's no way I could have written it any other way. I couldn't tell people this is wrong and this is right, because I have no idea myself, right? So I'm just discovering and experimenting.
Yeah, I mean, right at in your introduction, it says, or you write, "If I seem an unlikely candidate to write about matters spiritual, you're probably right." So you kind of set yourself up not in any way as an expert.
Yes.
And yet, it's very well thought out, and there's there are very clear sort of lines to your thinking within this.
Well, I would really lay the blame or responsibility for that again back to the parenting I received. And when I say parenting, I'm talking about the spiritual parenting here, because I am unconventional from an Indian perspective in many ways in my lifestyle choices, but I grew up in something which is called an ashram. I don't know if you're aware of what an ashram is. It's like like the Buddhist temples, the traditional. It's something like that. So any spiritual master, he makes a place. So there's a temple, and it's his place, and people who come to him can stay there. And so I grew up in that, and I studied there. It's a free educational institution for anybody. There's a school, there's a university, and there's no fees, nothing. And so all these influences that I received, so I had a certain temperament, but there were other things that I was getting. And even at that time, there might be many things which I didn't value, or realize. But I think over a period of years, and especially after becoming a parent, there are lots of things you see anew. And things which seemed, then suddenly seem, they had a lot of value. And I think that's what comes across in the book, that you say well thought out, because all these last 20 years since I left university, I think I've been trying to apply those things and see, does this work? Well, can you be honest at work? How can you be honest at work? How can you, what is a compromise? What is valid? What is not valid? And things like that. And I think that's what comes through. So it's personal experience.
Talk a little bit about the structure of the book, about the chapters, the sub-chapters, again, about this sort of non-narrative, sort of the reflections and the conversations, and how they contribute to the development and the transmission of your ideas.
All right, so there's no linear narration in the story, but there is a movement. The book is divided into chapters, large chapters with sub-chapters, but overall it's moving from a place where my daughter raises the query of who am I and what happens to my mom, or what happens in this life, and moves towards a place of relative, I don't know if peace is the right word, but a transitory phase, because she was only 8 when I finished the book, where she somewhat starts finding her identity. So, but of course, like I said, she's too young for it to be the end. But hopefully, it's a transitory phase on which she can build on. So there is a movement, and within each major chapter, the sub-chapters build that arc. So, for example, what's that chapter? Who am I? Right? So it deals with the psychological security, say, my generation, so I had, versus my daughter, who is this mobile creature who doesn't know where home is. So it deals with that, and it moves how she finds her identity in spirit.
So it's like the same question, but sort of a different manifestation of it.
Yes.
Right.
So, but the thing is that many of my generation didn't have to think that question. It was understood who we were. We never had to think about this, who am I? They do, because they are not at home. We knew where we were. We knew who we were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What more general research did you do about writing a memoir, and how did this influence you?
For writing, for the memoir, I didn't have to do too much research, just very basic, to see if I could glean anything, but I actually didn't. But I think most of my research was related to grammar, because it had been so long since I had written anything, almost since school essays. I think the only writing I had done was Facebook updates. So I had to look up a lot on, is this word the right one? And living in China, there's been years when I haven't, read books, because there were no English books. There have been weeks when I haven't spoken English, because I lived in places where I wasn't meeting non-Chinese. So I've been very cut off from English for long periods of time, especially when we were in Chongqing and stuff. So there were lots of these. I think my research was more related to that. Grammar. There's a word for this. Vocabulary. Or is this right? Is this like even that simple things like it's with an apostrophe s or minus. I realized I had absolutely no recollection how it's used, and I had to go back and simple things like that, but I'd forgotten.
Right. I think many people will be glad that you checked up on the it's with an apostrophe. Yeah. It's a real bugbear for some people. Did you intend to write a memoir when you set out, or is that just how it's been described since it's been finished?
I did. Like I said, I wanted to write about the goodness that I had received, and I wanted to write about how my daughter was processing it, and that was the central theme. So I started with this thing. I want to share this.
The writing masterclass for this episode is, appropriately, how to write a memoir. And I wanted to start out, Long, by asking you, what's the difference between an autobiography and a memoir?
I think memoir is more limited in its scope, because it's not your whole life story, right? So it's about certain experiences which were perhaps transformational in some way, which made you rise or fall. And your experience of that. So memoir is much more limited in scope. But I think it has more scope for creativity in expression. You can embellish it, but of course by that I don't mean fictionalize it. But there is more scope to be creative in how you express it.
Sure. I mean, you're not limited so much by chronology.
Yes.
I mean, even non-chronological autobiographies you're still essentially describing a life,
right?
So there's always that sense of chronology running through.
Right.
Whereas I suppose with a memoir there isn't necessarily.
No, it doesn't have to be.
How can a writer approach a memoir then?
I'm no expert, but I can share what worked for me. And what worked for me was identifying that central argument, right? That the main idea. Once I had that. Any thoughts that I would have on that, I would just start writing it down. And like I said, it just started building, because some central theme would appear, linking them. And I just put it all together. And for every chapter, once I would start writing on it, I would write down the points and have the mind map. And like I said, okay, so these are the factors feeding into it, these are the factors leading out of it. And that worked for me. But that was a very flexible and a fluid mind map, because things would happen, and then I would always keep adding or deleting, depending on what conversations my daughter and I were having.
Did you do much sort of editing of the order of the things that you'd written or the points that you'd made? Did you sort of go back and change things around once themes had emerged? I mean, for example, might you have taken like a sub-chapter and inserted it into another parent chapter?
Yes. For some, I have done that, because sometimes it just, once I had written other chapters, it seemed it made more sense to shift it to some chapter where it kind of gave it a closure, and or something was just getting too long and I needed to trim it. So I did do that for some.
Did you then need to do a lot of sort of, I would imagine that it being, in order to do that, you would need to maybe take a step back, sort of leave off writing for a while and take a step back, then go back to it, sort of read it through where you got to so far, and see how the threads and the themes were emerging and seeing how cohesive they were. But doing that with some objectivity, or even perhaps by getting somebody else involved to look through it again. Did you feel the need to do that?
For some chapters, yes. For some chapters, no. I was right, and it would say for some longer chapters, it took me sometimes about a month. But I didn't write in a very disciplined way. So sometimes I would write in spurts, and then I would get busy with something, maybe some movies or some silly romance, and then because for me this whole writing this book was a very sacred kind of, almost sacred kind of very spiritual experience. So I didn't want to do it when I was not fully in it. So if I was distracted, I wouldn't write it, and then after a few weeks I would come back. Okay, I want to write it, and I would start writing, and then the words would just flow whenever I sat. But yes, for some I had to give a distance. For some, because I was working on it for a whole month, it didn't. It just worked. But there's this one chapter called Beyond Boundaries, where I describe growing up at the ashram, and that required a little work in terms of trimming, because I had so much to write and so much I wanted to say, and it was a lot. And but I thought I needed a little, because I identified so much with that. I kept it away for a few months and came back, and it was easier to trim some things which were perhaps could do without.
Right. I mean, that's my next question. How, I mean, even if you're not writing your entire life, you're still the source of your material. There's such a wealth of personal material that you must have. So how can a writer sort of edit all of that down into something that is cohesive and concise?
I think keeping focus on the larger picture helped. Not identifying yourself too strongly with the work that you're working on. I think that helped. Now, whether you want to call it detachment or distance or whatever you want to call it, for me, I felt that worked. Even just, for example, like just thinking, feeling like, okay, I am the instrument through which this idea is coming through. And I think just working in that psychological bubble gave me a distance. So then you're not thinking, oh no, but I love this incident, I want to put it. Just more of, okay, does this incident need to be here? It was easier. It was just a step back. So it wasn't my story. It was through me a larger story is being told. And I would like to think that perhaps that larger spirit under which the book is written is what is touching people across boundaries.
Right. Yeah. And then, so then I wonder, did you sort of have a phase where you kind of got all of that down and got all of it out of the way and sort of got all of your notes down there so that you could then take a step back from it and sort of pick and choose what you needed, or was it just sort of there in your head and you were able to keep that objectivity? Because for me, I think I would have to write everything down and have all my darlings sort of there, and then I'd be able to take a step back from it, having made the notes.
It depends. I mean, there were some things I had just written, maybe in points, bullet point kind of thing. And later on when I wrote it, I felt I don't need it. For some, it was like that. For some, I had to write down, like I said, about being a student in an ashram. I wrote it down in this one, I don't know how many days long spell, and I just wrote, and it became this long 15, 20 pages chapter. And for that, I had to step back, and I think I required the distance. And it is very strange, but one chapter which actually troubled, which my publisher suggested I trim, and is a chapter called Surrender. And it's strange because it's very symbolic, the chapter, even the name, Surrender. It's because it has a lot of personal material, of more personal. I mean, of course, the whole book is personal, but more to do with my youth, and so more intimate details about my life. And that one I had to trim. And for some reason, maybe because of the nature of the thing, I actually found it difficult to trim that. And I had to literally surrender it to that, that bigger idea, where I spoke about it being the larger picture, keeping that in mind. And actually, when I did that, I still remember that moment when it happened. When I did that, and suddenly everything fell into place, I found something which fit into that narrative, which kind of linked all the subchapters and things which had to go. It just somehow that wall fell in place, enabling me to do that.
Right. I'm going to trouble you for your top 3 tips for writing a memoir. So what's your number 1?
So the first would be something which I've mentioned, I think, a few times already, is this sense of detachment from what you're working on. Even if it's your own story, but once you're putting it on paper, it's not yours anymore. I think that helps in the writing process, as well as especially in the editing process, because in the writing process you might want to not keep it because you want to feel the emotions that you want to express. But in the editing process, I think it's very important to have this distance from your work, because otherwise all those incidents are so personal. They might have a very big impact for you personally, but you might not be able to convey it to a larger audience. It may not mean anything to them.
Right.
So that's my first one.
Okay, number 2.
Number 2, if it's a memoir such as mine, where things were happening in real time, I think there might be a temptation to manipulate your life to fit the book. It's like how we experience events these days to fit our Facebook updates.
Right.
So it's a similar thing. So I was conscious that I don't do that, because obviously I didn't want to manipulate what I'm giving my daughter. But I was conscious about that, because sometimes there was this thing, if I say this, she'll say something and I'll get some material for the book. And I didn't want to do that.
So there was sort of a dual thing going on. The first part being that you didn't want the book to influence your real life and what you were saying to your daughter, but also that you wanted the book itself to be truthful.
Yes.
And not and to sort of, as much as possible, keep that sort of documentary objectiveness.
Yes. And sometimes that can be difficult, because of course it's happening. Well, if I tweak this little bit and she'll say something, and it's sometimes it is a temptation. But I was lucky. I mean, my daughter was expressive enough to not need my help, so we managed.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the last one I would like to share is something which was told to me when I started writing. I asked a friend of mine who's a writer, and I said, well, what any tips? What does one write about? How does one write? And I knew nothing. And he said, well, it's amongst the many things. One thing which stayed with me was, he said, try to make it general. And when I heard that, I didn't know what he meant. I think it's only after I wrote a lot of it that I started understanding what he meant, that in that particular, to find that universal, because ultimately it's not something you're writing for your own self. It's for people to read, and they have to be able to relate to that, and they can't do that if it's not expressed in terms that they can relate to.
All right. So you're publicising visa stickers and other matters of the soul at the moment. How's that going?
Sometimes very well. Sometimes challenging, because being in China, that's not where my readership is based. There's a negligible number of people who read English there. So most of it is on social media. I think social media is great in that terms. I'm getting good reviews, good feedback from people who are doing it. And I had the opportunity of presenting the book to the consul generals in Hong Kong and in Guangzhou. So they were excited and very encouraging to have an Indian write about this. So let's see. I'm actually now thinking of perhaps approaching people in Hong Kong to see if we can do some discussions or something around third culture children. But let's see. It's something I need to work on.
All right.
I hope it goes well.
Yeah, I hope so too. Well, thank you very much for coming in and for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me.
The Hong Kong Writers Circle podcast, episode 11, Visa, Stickers and Other Matters of the Soul, was produced by me, Simon Overton. For more information, including show notes and the podcast archive, please visit our website, hkwriterscircle.com. Excerpts were from Visa, Stickers and Other Matters of the Soul by Harshni Chauhan, published by Macmillan, India, and from Two Women from India and God, a review of Visa, Stickers and Other Matters of the Soul by Vamsee Juluri, available online at huffingtonpost.com. The music was by Quantum Jazz, from the album End of the Line, used under the terms of a Creative Commons Attribution and Share-alike license. Thanks as always to Katrina Teh for the podcast artwork.